So I just wanted to review with you a method for creating a drop-down menu with multiple levels. In this exercise, we're going to be working on this page right here, which is just a simple HTML5 web page, and I already have my unordered list with the nested unordered list items, so we'll be using this to create our drop-down menus. Real quick in our code, I have a basic HTML5 document. I'm pointing to the HTML5 shiv just in case older versions of IE come to my page. They'll be able to render the page correctly. And then I have the HTML down here, and the page is pretty simple. I have a header tag which contains a navigation tag which contains an unordered list, and you can see that two of my top tier menu items, our company and products, contain a secondary unordered list. This is going to be the drop-down menu. The one thing that's important to note here is when you create these drop-down menus, you need to make sure that the closing li tag for the top tier menu item wraps around the nested unordered list. So you can see here is the closing li tag for our company. This unordered list exists inside of that li tag, and the same thing is true over here for products. You can see here's the closing li tag for the products menu item, and it also contains an unordered list. And then the rest of the page just contains some dummy content. The CSS that I have is just creating some basic formatting on the page. I have a rule here that is going to style all of the HTML5 elements as display. I'm using the universal selector to zero out my margin and padding. I'm setting a default font family and font size on the body tag. We have some styles on the H1, H2, and paragraph tags that just style them accordingly. And then I'm setting a fixed width on my section, header, and footer tags, and also centering that content by using the margin auto on the right and the left. In addition to that, I have some rules for my footer tag that just change the size of the paragraph text in the footer and give the footer a background color. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to create the CSS that we're going to need for the navigation. I've already created some CSS-based comments here so that I can include this CSS within this section of my CSS file. We're going to begin by just getting the basic CSS drop-down functionality working. We're going to use specificity in CSS and some advanced selectors so that we can target individual elements that are buried deep in our DOM structure. In this way, we don't need to use extra IDs or classes. It is possible to create this sort of drop-down menu by adding IDs or classes, but this method will be a little bit cleaner. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to hide the sub-menu items by targeting that nested unordered list with a display of none. So we'll go ahead and we'll use the selector of nav ul and we'll just set the display to none. If we save our page and look in the browser, you can see that the nested list items are now going to disappear. In order to make these elements reappear on the page, we're going to convert them back to block level elements on the hover of the parent li. So for this selector, we're going to use nav ulli:hover, and then I'm going to use a descendant selector of ul. So what this selector is this selector is a child combinator. It also is known as a direct descendant combinator. And what it means is that the selector only is going to select unordered lists of the nav ulli, and we're specifying when it's being hovered. So they have to be directly, this unordered list has to be directly inside a hovered li that also is a child of a ul and child of the nav tag. So we're getting kind of specific with our selectors there. And then the property that we're going to pass on is the display is going to change to block. So if we save our page and check it in the browser, you can see that when I hover over these two areas, our company and products, the sub navigation is going to show up. Now obviously this isn't functioning in the way that we want it to, but it is allowing the unordered lists to kind of toggle and be on and off depending on what's being hovered. And once again, using this child combinator right here ensures that only the child UL of an LI that is being hovered is going to be targeted rather than all of the submenus appearing at one time. Then I'm going to start to style up the main navigation menu and create kind of a menu bar. So here I'll make a rule for the nav UL, and I'm going to set my background color to a light gray color. I'm going to add padding on the top and bottom of 0 and 20 pixels to the right and the left, just so that any of my text will not crash into the edge of the main containing nav bar that we're creating. I'm also going to get rid of all of the bullets by using a list style type of none, and then we'll also set the position to relative, because in this example we're going to be using positioning. So I'm going to set the nav ULs to relative so that I can absolutely position child elements within them. If we save and check it out in the browser, our page now looks like this. So you can see that these are now contained inside of a gray bar. Now, in order to get our menu items to appear side by side, we're going to be using a float. So I'm going to create a rule for float, and we're just going to target the nav UL LIs, and we'll give them a float of left. Now when I do that, the menu is going to appear horizontally, which is how I want it. You can see that the gray bar has now been collapsed, and that is a result of the floats. Also, this H1 breaking news is now pulled up and is appearing to the left of our menu item. In order to fix this, we're going to need to insert a clear into our code. And we're going to use a method of inserting the clear which takes advantage of one of the CSS properties called content. We're going to use this property of content in conjunction with the after pseudo element. So what we'll write here is we'll write a rule for nav UL after. And this pseudo element is not actually selecting anything that exists on the page, but it's adding something new to the page. So for instance, I'm going to use the content property, and then inside of quotes I'm going to pass on what I want to appear on the page. So I'm just going to have it say some text. If I save this page and I go into the browser and I refresh, you're going to see that now some new text is appearing on my page. So this is not part of the HTML. This is being dynamically created by our CSS. But using pseudo element with content can be really useful to doing all kinds of cool things. What we're going to do here is we're going to target the nav UL after, so after any UL, and then we're going to actually insert nothing on the page. We don't want anything visible to actually show up on the page, but we're using this as a hook so then we can apply the clear both. And I'm going to have to make this display as a block level element. And as soon as I make these simple rules right here, when I save my page and I refresh in the browser, you can see that now the float is no longer problematic to us. The breaking news does not appear up to the right of our menu bar, and in addition to that, our gray color has now been resolved as well. And luckily, this pseudo element of colon after is pretty well supported in all of our browsers. It actually goes all the way back to IE8 as long as you're using the single colon CSS2 syntax for applying the pseudo element. So using this is very safe because you can go all the way back to version 8, and it really has quite a large percentage of adoption. All the other modern browsers are able to render it just fine. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make a rule for my nav UL LI hover. So this is just going to be a basic rule when you hover over a list item, and I'm just going to change the background color of the list item so that it shows a different color. So when you hover over, we'll make the list item appear as a dark blue, and then in addition to that, I'm going to make a rule for the actual links themselves. And so we'll use a selector of nav UL LI hover A. So I'm targeting here A tags that are nested inside an LI that's being hovered, and we're just going to change the font color on those to white. So if we save our page now and we refresh in the browser, you can see when I hover over, we get a blue background and the text is turning to white. Let's make a general rule for our A tags just to style these a little bit as well. I'm going to use a selector of nav UL LI A, and we'll have these guys display as block level elements We're going to add some padding onto them, so we'll use 10 pixels for the top and the bottom, 20 pixels for the right and the left. We're going to set the color of the text to being a darker gray, and we'll remove the underline by using text decoration of none. So if we refresh now, our page looks like this. The bar starts to look kind of a little bit more like what I had in mind. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to create some spacing on the top of my nav bar and the rest of the content that follows. I'll just go ahead and set a margin of 50 pixels on the top. We're going to use auto for the right and the left and 25 pixels for the bottom. And all this is going to do is it's just going to push our nav bar away from the top part of the browser. Since we don't have any other content there, we don't want it resting right on the top of the browser. Alright, so our nav bar itself looks pretty good. Now we're going to address the issue of our drop-down menu. Currently, because we're using a float left on our LIs, the drop-down menus are also floating to the left. We don't want them to float to the left. We want them to be stacked vertically. So we're going to make a specific selector that's going to allow us to get rid of that float on the nested LI items. So currently they're getting the float left on this nav UL LI. What we're going to do is we're going to make a rule for nav UL li. So now I'm going to target specific list items that have to be nested 2 layers deep, and we're just going to tell the float to be none. So just by doing this, if we save and we refresh in the browser, now when I hover over, you can see that my submenu items are now appearing vertically underneath. So that looks better. But clearly this gray bar is spreading. We actually just want the little menus to pop out. We'll have to target those by affecting some position settings. Let's go into our CSS, and we already have a rule for nav UL where we're changing the display to none. I'm going to also position these absolute. And by doing that, when we look in the browser, you can see that now these are working in a much better way. So this is more like a traditional drop-down menu. We're going to clean this up just a little bit. So I'm going to get rid of the padding because it's also inheriting some padding from our nav UL right here. So we're getting padding on the right and the left. We don't need that padding for the nested items, so we'll just go ahead and overwrite that by using a padding of 0. So that looks much better right there. There's one other thing that I'm going to add to this rule, which doesn't seem like it's much of an issue in this particular browser, but in order to make sure that this works across the board, even in older browsers, I'm going to specify that these submenu items are positioned absolutely 100% from the top of the UL, which is basically going to be the bottom of the UL. We're going to add a property for top and set it to 100%. This is how the menu currently is working in Chrome, which is the browser that I'm previewing this in, but I want to make sure that this is something that will work in older browsers too. So I'm just going to add that in there to ensure that that does function in the manner that we would want. So the last thing that I want to do is when I hover over these menus, I'd like the text to appear in gray instead of white. So we'll just make a rule to style that particular property. And we're going to have to use a pretty specific selector to do that. I'll come down here to the bottom, and I'm going to use a selector of nav UL li hover, and then I'm going to do UL lia, and we're just going to set the color of the text, and we'll use a darker gray color. So now when we drop down, the text is gray. Now it stays gray when we hover over, so we'll have to make one more rule just to ensure that the text turns white again. I'm going to use a similar rule here. We'll just specify that we want to do nav UL li colon hover, and then we'll specify a. And I have to be this specific because I was this specific in the above rules. So this rule actually is this kind of the same as this rule right here. I'm going to set the text color to white, and that should do it. When we go back and refresh our menu, you can see that now we have nice drop-down menus. They turn white and they have the blue background when they're being hovered over, and that looks pretty good. So this is just an alternate method of creating drop-down menus using a pure CSS solution.